So let's continue building our API. What we are going to build is basically the backend for the Beyonce app that some of you started using. So the started building in React. So we in that code, if you remember, we had a call to an API, and we just get a response, a data that has the albums for Beyonce. So we are going to build that API ourselves. In what we did, we just use Git in a way that sounds like an API, but we're just going to build the proper API using Express. So the first endpoint that we're going to build is a get endpoint. So we'll say, when we try to get the albums, we want to get the albums basically. So the resources that we're getting is albums. So following REST, which is, like I said, the style of building API, we have to define the resource and use a proper verb, because that could have been a URL called /get albums if we want, or don't know, Beyonce's album get anything. We define that, as long as the client is using the URL that we defined, it works. But using REST, there is a standard way of defining things to make it easier for clients to talk to. So we think about the resource, which album, and then we use the HTTP verbs in a way to get and update and so on. So what we will do is we'll build an API that does CRUD. That's create, retrieve, update, delete. So we are in the retrieve phase now. We will get the albums, and then we will also have an endpoint to get a specific album. So it'll be album / some album ID, for example, albums /12, and then an endpoint to create an album, and one for updating and deleting. But for now, let's start with the simple one, which is the get albums. The data for that, we have it in the lesson. It's just an array of some albums data, and I'll just put it here outside this at the same level as the app and Express, so the global level of this module. And that's wrong, but it's because we discussed before having state in a global scope. But at this stage, we'll just use it here. We'll put the albums data here, and this is our albums data. So when we hit /albums, we want to return to the user the albums data. How do we find the endpoint then? It's the same, app.get /albums is what we need, and then we say res, and we can say res.send albums data. And now if I close my server and npm start again, our postman, .cif, I say /albums with a get, then I'm getting back a response, and it's a JSON response, and it has the data here. So that's our first endpoint. Now let's build the next endpoint, and this is gonna be get /albums, but then it's /albums, and the next part of it is the album ID. So that's a dynamic thing. It can be get me the album ID number 10, number 11, whatever. So we need a way to define a variable basically. And the way you do that with Express is that you have a semicolon and then some album ID, for example, as a variable name. And then again, we have a request and a response like always. And I can then get, if I console log rec dot params, let us say what happens here. Just console log this rec dot params, and then if I go back, to sort out my postman. Then if I say /10, see that it is hanging, no response is coming back, and that's because we didn't say the way a response is sent back is by saying res.send or some action on res. There's few methods. We didn't, so it's hanging. But you see here in the console log, in the server, it's there. You see that value for rec.params has, it's an object and has album ID 10. If we send 12, then we'll get album ID 12. So we can get hold of the value of album ID by just can say here guess the album ID equal rec.params.album ID, and that will get us album ID. And there is a way to do this. Use ES6 for the structuring. This is for you. Try to use a different syntax to achieve the same. And then once we have the album ID, we can get it from the album data. So album data is just an array. If you want to get a specific item out of it, we can use one of the functions that we used. Can use find because we're just interested in one, and that takes a parameter, call it album, and we give it a function method to do the matching. It should be album ID equal album ID here, and because album ID it's a string here as well. It's convenient. If it was a number, then we'd have needed to convert it to a number to do matching with triple equal. So this should return for us. We should get back the album, and then we can say res.send album. So we're just returning a single album. And if I kill the server and npm start it again, then if I say albums/12, I did not get that, but I went ahead and cheated just to see what's happening there. So maybe it's useful actually. I didn't expect that to happen, and I want to know why it happened. So I could, as a quick way, just see console log here the value for album, and when I run that again, album 12, I can see in the log that album is actually undefined, and that's because there is actually no album 12 in the data that we have. So if I put albums 10, then I'm getting back a JSON. It's not an array anymore because we decided to just get one. If you used filter, it would have been an array, but it's our API, and we decided no, we just return a single one when we get a single one. So maybe we should, when we get 12, we should not, we can return 200 and empty, and that's our API. We can do whatever we want. So we could return an empty response, but since we're using REST, this style, we make use of the verbs, we make use of the resources, but it's also good to make use of these status codes. We know that 200 means okay, but we know when we don't find something, there is also a status code for that, which is 404, not found. So Let's handle that then. Instead of returning 200 and empty, if not there is no match, maybe we can just say if not album, if we don't have album data, then instead of res.send, we can say res.send, and you can give it 404, and else we can, if there is a match, then we can return the album itself. So now if we restart this, if we restart and just hit the endpoint, we're getting 404 not found, which is a better response for the client, that we know what happened. And if we say something that exists, we're getting 200 OK with the data back in it. So this is a better design for our API. It follows the REST style, which makes use among, it's a big topic, REST, but one of the things that we try to make with REST is to make use of HTTP protocol and HTTP criteria. So we're using the verbs and we're using the status codes in a way that that's meaningful, that follows HTTP conventions. So 404 for not found. If we got an error, we will send back 500 or 500 something for errors, and there is a lot of other things that have specific meanings for not authorized, for example, or anything else.